Let's start with a number that says everything. In 2018, 63% of Australians agreed that migrants from all over the world made their country stronger. That was the mood at that time. Confident, open, proud of the mix. Fast forward to today, and something has flipped. Now, over a third of the country says it's fine to deport asylum seekers straight back to where they came from. Not manage them, not process them, just send them back. Half the country now believes immigration has made them poorer. And when you look at rent prices, at housing waitlists, at young people who can't afford to leave their parents' house, it's hard to blame them for feeling that way. To understand the anger, you have to go back. In 2019 and 2020, the pandemic slammed the border shut. For the first time since the First World War, Australia's population actually shrank. No tourists, no students, no workers, just an empty runway and a country holding its breath. For a nation that had built its entire economic model on people arriving, this was a gut punch. Migration wasn't just welcomed in Australia. It was load-bearing. Rewind further to the early 1990s. Australia was clawing its way out of a brutal recession, and a huge number of Australians credit migration as the reason the economy came back to life. New workers, new businesses, new tax dollars. Migration wasn't the problem back then, it was the fix. But there's another thread running underneath all of this, and it's darker. Since the late 1990s, Australia has been wrestling with people arriving by boat, desperate families fleeing war zones in Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and across the Middle East, risking their lives on the water routes through Indonesia. Arrivals spiked in the early 2000s and spiked again between 2012 and 2013, with more than 20,000 people a year risking everything for a chance at safety. Then came the moment that changed everything. A Norwegian cargo ship called the MV Tampa pulls more than 400 stranded asylum seekers out of the ocean. Their lives had just been saved. And Australia said no. Turned the ship away at the border. Prime Minister John Howard's words became a slogan that would define a generation of policy. We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. That single sentence split the nation in two. On one side, fear of losing control of the border. On the other, the basic humanity of people fleeing for their lives. Australia has never fully closed that wound. Out of the Tampa crisis came the Pacific solution, asylum seekers processed not on Australian soil, but shipped off to remote camps on Nauru and Manus Island, kept far from the mainland, far from lawyers, far from cameras. In the 6 years after it began, only 23 boats reached Australia. Compare that to 43 boats carrying more than 5,000 people in 2001 alone. The policy worked in the coldest sense of that word. Then in 2013, Australia went even harder. Operation Sovereign Borders, a military-run crackdown that physically turned boats around at sea and sent them back the way they came. Boat arrivals collapsed. Human rights groups called it cruel. Other governments quietly took notes. Denmark, in particular, looked at Australia's border playbook and liked what it saw: tightening family reunification rules, pushing for offshore asylum processing of its own. The BBC put it bluntly. Australia wrote the Stop the Boats manual, and other countries are now reading from it. But offshore detention came at a price nobody could hide. A 2014 Human Rights Commission inquiry uncovered reports of abuse, mental health crises, and children locked away in these camps for years. At its peak, running these facilities cost Australian taxpayers more than $1 billion a year, while the people inside them waited in limbo with no end date. Manus Island finally closed in 2017. Nauru was scaled right back. But the legal and moral argument over what Australia did there still hasn't gone away. Here's the part that makes this whole story so tangled. Australia isn't just fighting off people it doesn't want. It's still one of the most desirable places on the planet to build a life. Australians are genuinely wealthy. Back in 2021, Australia had the highest median wealth per adult in the entire world, around $273,900 US, nearly 3 times higher than the median in the United States. Average wealth per adult sat above $500,000, putting Australia fourth globally, behind only Switzerland, the US, and Hong Kong. Wages tell the same story. The average Australian salary sits around $63,750 US a year. Compare that to roughly $47,700 in the UK or $45,100 in France. On top of that, 13 million Australians carry private health insurance, layering extra protection on top of an already strong public system. So of course people want in. Australia isn't just selling a passport. It's selling a lifestyle that most of the world can only imagine. And yet, the happiness numbers are starting to crack. In 2024, Australia ranked as the 10th happiest country on Earth. But break that down by age and the story flips. For people under 30, Australia ranked 19th. For people over 60, it jumped up to 9th. Translation: young Australians are hurting, and a huge part of that pain is being pinned on one thing: migration, and the housing crisis it's tangled up with. This is the nerve center of the whole debate. By the end of 2025, Australia's population had climbed past 27.8 million people, with net overseas migration adding around 300,000 people that year alone, down from a jaw-dropping peak of 538,000 during 2022 and 2023, right after the borders reopened post-pandemic. That catch-up wave, after 2 years of closed borders, crashed straight into a housing market that was nowhere near ready. Home building approvals fell to some of their lowest levels in over a decade. Rents surged, and politicians on the right began pushing something once unthinkable, tying the number of migrants Australia lets in directly to the number of houses actually being built. One proposal from the opposition would cap total net migration at whatever level matches new housing supply each year. Economists have pushed back hard, warning it could just as easily validate today's high numbers as cut them, and that it ignores everything else migration touches: skills shortages, an aging population, university funding, the federal budget. International students have become the lightning rod in this fight, even though the numbers don't fully support the blame. Research shows international students make up only around 6% of the national rental market, yet they've been hit with enrollment caps anyway. Australia had already restricted new international student places down to 270,000 for 2025. In 2026, that cap was actually raised to 295,000, with universities now required to prove they're building student housing and strengthening ties with Southeast Asia before they're allowed to take on more. Universities Australia has warned that slashing student numbers further would blow a hole in the economy without fixing a single housing problem. Students, they argue, are being scapegoated for a crisis they didn't create. Behind the headlines about boats and students, there's a quieter problem. Somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 visa holders overstay in Australia every single year, a number that dwarfs boat arrivals, but barely makes the news. Many of these overstayers end up in exploitative jobs: hospitality, construction, industries where they have no legal protection and no leverage. Reports suggest 1 in 6 migrant workers in Australia has faced exploitation, with a striking share of recently arrived migrants paid below the national minimum wage. In response, raids and deportation orders have spiked hard through the 2020s, with hundreds of thousands of people flagged as potentially removable from the country under new government measures. And then there's the fear, the part of this story that's impossible to talk about calmly. Organized crime networks, including an Albanian crime syndicate operating drug houses across the country, have fed a growing public narrative linking migration to crime. A border force official was accused of taking bribes to wave through a massive cocaine shipment. In February 2024, 7 immigration detainees, people convicted of homicide or attempted homicide, were released back into the Australian community, sparking outrage that hasn't fully died down since. Then came December 2025. 2 men opened fire on a crowd gathered for Hanukkah celebration at Bondi Beach. 15 people were killed, including an elderly Holocaust survivor and a 10-year-old girl whose family had fled the war in Ukraine, believing Australia would keep them safe. One of the attackers had migrated from India decades earlier on a student visa before becoming a permanent resident. His son, born in Australia, was charged alongside him. The country was shattered, and almost immediately the government moved. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced a full review of migration law, new hate speech offenses, and sweeping new powers for the Minister of Home Affairs to cancel or refuse visas for anyone found spreading hatred or division. The political opposition, midway through drafting its own tougher migration policy, paused it entirely, not because the anger had gone away, but because the moment felt too raw to weaponize. That single night in December reshaped the entire national conversation about who gets let in and how closely they're screened before they arrive. It wasn't the only ugly scene. Months earlier, anti-immigration rallies had spilled into the streets, some infiltrated by neo-Nazi groups. Political leaders were forced onto television to draw a hard line. Neo-Nazis and anti-immigration rallies are not who we are. These are not Australian values. For a country that prides itself on multiculturalism, watching hate marches down its own streets was a gut check nobody wanted. While all of this plays out, there's a quieter emergency sitting off Australia's coastline. Pacific Island nations are watching the ocean rise around them, and Australia, despite calling itself a regional leader, has resisted creating any lasting legal pathway for climate refugees, offering only small, temporary schemes like the one set up for citizens of Tuvalu. Critics say this timidity is already damaging Australia's relationships with its Pacific neighbors, and the problem will only grow as the water keeps rising. So where does that leave Australia? Homelessness had already topped 122,000 people, even before this recent wave of pressure. Housing approvals are near historic lows. And underneath every argument about visas and boats and caps sits an older, rawer wound. The fact that European colonization of this land began in 1788, and the country's indigenous peoples are still fighting for recognition today. The failed 2023 referendum on an indigenous voice to Parliament reopened that wound publicly, with some arguing that mass immigration dilutes indigenous voices in the national conversation even further. Australia built its modern success on the backs of migrants. Its recovery from recession, its economic engine, its universities, its labor force, all of it leans on people arriving from somewhere else. But right now, in 2026, that same country is asking itself a question it hasn't had to ask in decades. How much can we take, how fast, and at what cost to the people already here? History has a habit of repeating itself in Australia. The only question now is whether this generation handles it any differently than the last one did.